They laughed at my empty pockets at the wedding table. I smiled and said nothing. I let the work do the talking. And if you've ever walked into a room full of people who already decided you weren't enough, people who looked at your hands, your clothes, your silence, and made up their minds before you ever opened your mouth, then this story is for you. Because I was that man. I was the one they whispered about in the hallway. I was the one they said didn't belong. And I need you to stay with me today, because what happened next is something I still have to remind myself was real. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who is still in the middle of their fight, someone who needs to know that the table turns. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because everything we talk about here is for the people who are still building, still bleeding, still believing. Now let's get into it. My name is DeShawn Carter. I grew up on the west side of Atlanta, in a neighborhood where the houses were small and the dreams were either very big or completely buried, depending on who you asked. My mother worked the front desk at a medical clinic for 22 years. My father did HVAC repair, commercial units, rooftop systems, the kind of work that nobody sees until it stops working. They were good, honest, hardworking people who gave me everything they had, which was love and not much else in the way of material things. And I mean that with no bitterness. They gave me the most important thing. They gave me the understanding that work is not beneath you, that showing up is not optional, that your name is worth more than your bank account. I didn't go to college. I enrolled for one semester at a community college outside the city, but money ran out before the semester did, and I made a decision that I was going to stop waiting for the right conditions and start building with what I had. What I had was a mind that liked to fix things and hands that weren't afraid to get dirty. I got a job at a small electronics and appliance repair shop in Southwest Atlanta. Cash-paid customers, walk-ins, the kind of place where the parking lot had 2 potholes that never got filled and the sign out front had a letter missing for 3 years. I worked there for 4 years. I learned everything. That's where I met Renee. She came in on a Friday afternoon with a tablet that had cracked and a deadline that hadn't. She was put together, precise, the kind of woman who explained the problem in full before you asked a single question. I fixed it while she waited. She said thank you in a way that meant it. She came back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. The third time she came back, there was nothing broken. We both knew it. We talked for an hour and a half about everything and nothing, and by the time she left, I knew I was in trouble in the best possible way. Renee Caldwell came from one of those Atlanta families, you know the ones, 3 generations of wealth, property, degrees, and connections. Her father, Bernard, had built a commercial construction company over 40 years that had its hands in half the development projects across the metro area. Her mother, Gloria, had a way of being gracious that still somehow left you feeling like you had been assessed and found wanting. Her older brother, Damon, was a corporate attorney who wore his success the way some people wear cologne. You could smell it before he entered the room. Her younger brother, Troy, was louder, flashier, the kind of man who talked about money the way insecure people do, constantly and always in numbers. They were black excellence by every traditional definition of the term, and they looked at me like I was a problem Renee had picked up off the street. We dated for 2 years. In those 2 years, I attended more Caldwell family gatherings than I could count, and at every single one I felt the same thing, a politeness so thin you could see the dismissal right through it. Bernard would ask about the shop with the tone of a man humoring a child. Gloria would pivot to Renee within 30 seconds, as if I had already been filed and set aside. Damon would shake my hand and then turn his back before the grip released. Troy was the worst, because Troy didn't bother with the thin politeness. He said what the others were only thinking. At a 4th of July cookout, I remember the smell of the grill, the way the backyard of their Buckhead home seemed to go on forever, the white linen tablecloths that somehow didn't look ridiculous outdoors when you had that kind of money. Troy raised his glass during what was supposed to be a toast to the family and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, that he admired Renee's commitment to seeing the best in people even when the rest of us can't see what she sees. He smiled when he said. He looked right at me. Nobody corrected him. Bernard took a sip of his drink. Gloria touched her napkin. Damon found something interesting to look at on the other side of the yard. Renee's hand found my knee under the table and pressed down, steady, like an anchor. I smiled. I said nothing. I set my glass down and I ate my food. That night, I lay in the dark of my apartment, the one I rented off Campbellton Road, second floor, the one with the window unit that rattled when the temperature dropped, and I made a decision that I have never regretted. I decided I was done trying to be seen by people who had already closed their eyes. I was going to build something so undeniable that sight would become involuntary. You wouldn't need to choose to see it. It would simply be there. I proposed to Renee 6 months later. The ring was modest. I was honest about that. I told her what it cost. I told her that it was everything I had saved in 4 months, and I told her that it was a down payment on a promise, not the promise itself. She held my face in her hands and said yes before I finished the sentence. That woman has never once made me feel like the ring was anything less than perfect. Not once. In all the years since, not once. The wedding was beautiful. The reception was held at a venue in Midtown that the Caldwells had selected and largely funded, and I accepted that with grace, because I understood what it meant to them, and because Renee wanted to be married, and I wanted to marry her, and the rest was just logistics. But I sat at that reception table and I felt the room. I felt the way Bernard's friends looked at me, not with hostility exactly, but with that particular Atlanta old money curiosity that is really just another form of appraisal. I heard the word shop used twice in the same sentence with a smile that had no warmth in it. I watched Troy tell a story at the bar that made 3 men laugh and glance in my direction. I smiled. I said nothing. I went home from my own wedding reception and, after Renee fell asleep, I sat at the small desk in the corner of our bedroom and I wrote down 3 things I was going to build in the next 5 years. Not goals, not dreams, plans. Specific, measurable, executable plans. I wrote them in a notebook I still have. The handwriting is a little shaky, which I think was the champagne, but the intention behind every word was stone-cold sober. I want to tell you about the work, because I think people skip over the work when they tell these stories, and the work is the whole story. In year 1, I used every dollar Renee and I had saved together. $9,400, and I incorporated a business, DeShawn Carter Enterprises, LLC. It looked ridiculous on paper at the time. A man from a repair shop on the west side with a business name that sounded like a corporation. I didn't care. I named it that on purpose. You have to build the container before you fill it. I identified a gap in the Atlanta market, mid-sized commercial properties, office buildings, retail spaces that needed consistent, reliable electronics infrastructure work. Not repair, infrastructure. The build-out and maintenance of the systems that make commercial spaces function. HVAC-linked smart systems, security integration, network cabling. My father had taught me the bones of commercial systems. I spent 18 months teaching myself the rest. I hired 1 subcontractor, then 2. Then I landed my first real commercial contract with a property management group in Marietta, and that contract paid for 3 months of operating costs and gave me the credibility to walk into the next meeting with something real in my hand. The Caldwell family dinners continued through all of this. Thanksgiving at Bernard's, Christmas at Gloria's sister's house, Easter, birthday celebrations for people I barely knew. And at each one, the dynamic was the same. Bernard would ask with patient condescension how the business venture was going. I would simply say that it was growing. He would nod with the smile of a man who doesn't believe you but is too polished to say so. Troy would make comments that had just enough deniability to survive the dinner table. Damon would discuss his firm's latest victories with enough volume to fill the silence I left behind. One Christmas dinner, Troy said, with a glass of cognac in his hand and an audience of cousins around him, that some people confuse being busy with being successful, and that real success left evidence. He looked at me while he said it, long enough for it to land, short enough for him to claim later it wasn't directed at me. I looked at him. I picked up my water glass. I drank slowly. I set it down. I said nothing. That night, I went home and finalized a contract proposal that we submitted the following Monday. We won that contract. It was the largest one we had landed to date. I did not tell a single person in that family about it. Stay with me, because the moment they walked into my office, none of them recognized the man sitting behind that desk. By year 4, DeShawn Carter Enterprises had 23 employees and annual revenue that I will not state on this video because numbers are not the point of this story. The point is what those numbers represented. They represented every dinner I had sat through in silence, every glass I had set down without throwing it, every night I had worked past midnight while the city slept, every moment I had chosen construction over destruction, chosen building over bitterness. We had moved from our apartment to a home in Stonecrest, nothing that would impress the Caldwells by their standards, but ours, fully, completely ours, in every way that the word means something. Renee had built her own career as a curriculum director for a private school group, and we had built a life together that felt solid in the way that only things you build with your own hands can feel. Real, permanent, earned. In year 5, I was approached by a development investment group based in Charlotte that wanted to bring us in as a primary systems contractor for a portfolio of mixed-use development projects across the Southeast. It was the kind of contract that changes the shape of a company permanently. I spent 2 months in negotiation. I brought in a lawyer. I sat across from men who had built very large things, and I spoke their language with confidence because I had spent 5 years learning it word by word, late night by late night. We signed. I drove home from the signing and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was grateful, quietly, completely grateful, to my mother and my father, to Renee, to the boy who sat at that repair shop counter and believed, without any evidence at all, that this was possible. Then, about 7 months after that signing, something happened that I had not planned for and had not let myself imagine because imagining it would have felt too much like wanting it for the wrong reasons. Bernard called my cell phone on a Monday morning, not Renee's, mine. I had not received a personal call from Bernard Caldwell in 5 years of being his son-in-law. He asked if we could meet. He said it was about business. His voice was controlled, the way men who were raised to be controlled always are. But underneath the control, I heard something I had never heard from him before. I heard smallness. Not weakness. Bernard was not a weak man, but smallness. The specific smallness of a man who has run out of options. I told him to come to my office Thursday at 2 o'clock. I want to tell you what I did in the days between that call and Thursday, because it matters. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't call anyone to tell them what was coming. I didn't allow myself the easy pleasure of anticipation. I went to work. I ran my company. I went home and cooked dinner for Renee on Wednesday night, and we sat at our kitchen table and talked about her students and my contracts, and we laughed about something small and domestic that I've already forgotten, and it was the best night I had had in months. I tell you this because I want you to understand that the life I had built was not waiting for this moment to become real. It was already real. It was already full. What was coming Thursday was just the closing of a circle. Thursday at 2, my assistant Brianna called back to my office and said that 3 men were in the lobby, Bernard, Damon, and Troy. No appointment, just there. She said the older one was polite, but the energy in the room was off, and Brianna had excellent instincts. I told her 5 minutes, then bring them up. I sat at my desk. I straightened one folder. I looked out the window at Atlanta, the skyline I had watched for years from the west side as a thing that belonged to other people, and I thought about who I wanted to be in the next 30 minutes. Not what I wanted to say, who I wanted to be. There is a difference, and it is everything. Brianna brought them in. Bernard first, Damon behind him, Troy last, and Troy would not look up from the floor when he entered, which told me everything about the state of things before a single word was spoken. I stood. I extended my hand to Bernard. He shook it, both hands. He shook my hand with both of his and held it a moment. I do not think Bernard Caldwell had ever shaken anyone's hand with both of his in apology before that day. I believe it was the closest he knew how to get. I asked them to sit. They sat. I sat. I waited. Bernard spoke. The story came out in pieces, a construction deal that had gone catastrophically wrong, a contractor who had misrepresented financials and disappeared, a legal battle that had frozen assets at exactly the wrong moment, a bank that had called in a credit line, a second bank that had declined to help. 3 years of compounding damage. The Caldwell Company, 40 years old, 3 generations of work, was on the edge of something they couldn't recover from alone. They had been to everyone they knew. Bernard said my name was the last one on the list. He said it without looking away from me when he did, and I respected that. He did not apologize. Not yet. I noted it. I released it. I asked for the documents. I read through what they had brought for nearly 30 minutes. None of them spoke. The only sound in my office was pages turning, and once the distant sound of Atlanta traffic rising up from below. The situation was serious, but navigable. What they needed was a bridge, capital and credibility, and a name that could stabilize their position while the legal process worked. It was a real risk, but it was also a real need, and I was in the position to meet it. I closed the folder. I looked at Bernard, and this is the first twist, the one that surprised even me. I felt nothing that I expected to feel. I had imagined that this moment, if it ever came, would feel like vindication, like justice, like the satisfying conclusion of a long and painful story. What I actually felt was none of those things. What I felt was clear, still, like standing in an open field after a long rain, the air clean, the ground settled, everything exactly as it should be. When you have truly built something real, you no longer need the people who doubted you to suffer in order to feel the value of what you made. You already know what it's worth. You know it in your bones. I told Bernard that I would have my team complete a full review, and that if everything checked out, I would provide the bridge financing under a formal structured agreement. I told him it would be business, documented, clear terms, no favors, no ambiguity. And then I said one more thing. I said, I'm doing this because Renee is my wife, and because 40 years of work deserves a chance to survive one bad deal. I said it without cruelty, without performance. I meant every word. Bernard's eyes went somewhere I had never seen them go before. Not tears. Bernard was too formed for that in a business meeting. But something in his face released. A grip he had been holding for maybe just that morning. He nodded, once, and that nod carried more honesty than anything he had said to me in 7 years. The second twist came 2 weeks later. Damon called me directly, not about the deal. The deal was moving through my team's review and everything was proceeding. He called me because he had something personal to say, and he had chosen to say it like a man, face to face. He came to my office alone, and he sat across from me, and he said, quietly, without theatrics, that he had spent years treating me like a category, a conclusion he had already reached. He said watching me sit across from his father with that folder, choosing numbers over history, had shown him something about what real strength actually looked like. He said he had a daughter now. I told him that what he had just done, walking in here without being asked, without knowing how it would be received, that was harder than anything in any deal I had ever closed. I respected it. We shook hands. It was not dramatic. It was real. And real is always better than dramatic. The third twist, the one I never saw coming, not even close, arrived at a quiet lunch, just Bernard and me, 3 months after the financing agreement was signed and the Caldwell Company had begun to stabilize. He had asked to meet, not about business. We sat in a restaurant in Decatur, and he talked about his own father. He talked about growing up with money that came and went before it was supposed to be permanent, about learning to project wealth before he had it, about building the image first and the substance underneath it later. He said something that I have turned over in my mind 100 times since that lunch. He said that I reminded him of who he had been at 26, before the money had fully arrived, when he was still building with nothing but nerve and the refusal to quit. And he said that instead of recognizing that in me and honoring it, he had felt something closer to fear. That seeing me reminded him of a version of himself he had worked very hard to leave behind, and so he had looked down instead of across. I sat with that for a long time across the table from him. I sat with it on the drive home. I still sit with it, because it is one of the truest things anyone has ever said to me about why people do what they do. The cruelest voices in our lives are often just the most frightened ones. They are people who looked at your hunger and saw their own past and panicked. That does not make what they did right. It does not heal the nights you spent at a desk alone while they slept soundly in their big houses, sure that you would never arrive. But it makes them human. And when something becomes human, you can finally put it down. Bernard repaid the full financing 6 weeks ahead of schedule. He sent a handwritten letter with the final payment, 1 page, no grand declarations, just acknowledgement and gratitude, and 3 words at the end that I will keep between the two of us. I have that letter in my desk. I don't read it often. I just know it's there. Renee and I celebrated that week at a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, the same part of the city where her family had hosted our wedding reception all those years ago. We sat at a corner table, and she ordered everything she wanted, and we talked and laughed the way we always had, from the very beginning, before any of this. And I looked at her across that table, and I thought about the man who had walked into that reception with pressed clothes and quiet terror. I thought about the apartment off Campbellton Road. I thought about the notebook with the shaky handwriting. I thought about every morning I'd gotten up before the sun and every night I'd stayed up past it, and told myself, alone, with no proof, with no audience, that it was going to work. You are going to sit at tables where people look through you. You are going to be in rooms where someone with a finer watch and a bigger name has already decided what you're worth. Let them decide. Your job is not to argue with their conclusion using words. Your job is to make their conclusion impossible to hold on to using your life. Quietly, persistently, over years if that's what it takes. Because the best revenge is not arriving and gloating. The best revenge is arriving and helping. The best revenge is sitting across from the people who counted you out and saying, I see what you need, and I have the power to give it, and I choose to. That is not weakness. That is complete power. That is what the empty pockets were always building toward. Before I sign off, if this story moved you today, please share it right now. Put it in front of somebody who is sitting at a table where people are talking over them. Tell them the desk they're going to sit behind one day is still being built, and the only thing between them and that desk is the decision to stay in the work. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't. Every week I bring you stories like this one. Real stories about what building from the bottom actually looks like. Not the highlight reel. The whole thing. Come back for that. They came to me begging. I helped them anyway. That's the difference between who they were and who I chose to be.